Hi everybody, thank you for joining us on your Saturday morning or whatever time it is, wherever you are. Today we thought we'd do something a little bit different. We have Shaunaka Rishi, the director and the founder of the Oxford Centre for Hindu Studies. And he's going to talk a little bit today about the field of Hindu studies, modern Hindu studies, if you like, and why it's important, is it important? And a little bit how the OCHS meets the needs of a modern Hindu studies. So Shaunaka, he started the OCHS about 25 years ago, just short of 25 years. And due to his vision and his work, a whole lot of programs exist, a lot of publishing programs, research programs, and of course this program, which we are all part of today. So we thank him very much for that. And without further ado, I will pass you over to Shaunaka to speak and take a few questions and answers as well. So Shaunaka, it's all yours.
Thank you very much, Lau, and hello everybody. It's a bit of a strange subject in a sense, talking about the importance of Hindu studies when you're already doing Hindu studies. So yeah, I'm interested in the questions and answers to hear why you think Hindu studies is important as well. And do feel free to turn on your camera if you wish. It's always good to be able to see people, to interact with them. Kind of more personal, I suppose. And you'll never find out if I'm actually wearing trousers today. That's just the way it is. So Hindu studies is, when we started the centre started as things in Oxford in those days did start with a fireside chat. I was with the Regis Professor of Divinity, and he said, it'd be great to have a centre for Hindu studies, wouldn't it? And that was my invitation, the understated British invitation to start something. And we did. And but when we started it, we weren't aware that we were the only academic centre of Hindu studies of this kind in the world. And that was quite a shock, because I just suspected that in India, there must be tons of universities with departments of Hindu studies or programs of Hindu studies. I did know a number of scholars in the West who did Hindu studies, shall we say, but on the whole, their positions, their chairs were not chairs of Hindu studies, or their lectureships were not lecturing in Hindu studies. It was religion or philosophy or theology. And they just did Hindu studies because that was their personal interest. So we realized that we kind of had a responsibility, if no one else was going to take it, to help develop the field of Hindu studies in a systematic and strategic way. And that's, it's a bit of a responsibility, we could say, but it is something that we thought, well, no, this is a responsibility that we have to take seriously, because we're starting a new field. Now, how do you then study Hinduism? So what are the theories and the methods? So the study of religion, of sociology, of history, of philosophy, all have their theories and methods. But the fact is that were these theories and methods appropriate to study a tradition that's so different from the intellectual tradition that's trying to study them? If we're using the intellectual norms of the Enlightenment, which we do in the academy, which are developed from assumptions made by Greek philosophy and Abrahamic religion, are these appropriate viewpoints to look at other traditions? Is there an element of trying to push something into a round peg into a square hole? Are we acknowledging that Indian traditions may have an intellectual basis that's on par with anything that we've already come up with? And interestingly, in asking these questions, we found out very quickly that the assumption was that India and all other developing nations don't have much to offer in intellectual terms. And that decision had been made when long ago in the 18th century by the Europeans, not completely, but in terms of the people who were trying to dominate the region and colonize it. And we've dealt with colonialism, we think, and we're tearing down the statues as we speak. But have we dealt with the colonialism of the intellect, with spiritual colonialism, shall we say, as well. Are we imposing intellectual norms on traditions to try and understand them, not in their own terms, but in terms that we can understand? So the classic question I used to always be asked is, what's the Hindu Bible? And it's such a silly question, you might think, because it's assuming that Hindus have a book like the Bible. And the fact is they have hundreds of books like the Bible, shall we say. So there isn't one book. Unfortunately, Indian culture is developed in such a way that relationships are very important, and you never introduce a negative into a relationship. So if someone comes and says, will you attend my son's wedding? You nod your head in a certain way and say, oh yes, and it means no. Everyone knows it means no, but you didn't say it. And it took me a few years to discern that when dealing with Indians. They're not liars, as some 19th century writers decided, that they never tell the truth. They don't want to introduce a negative into a relationship. And what's the basis of that? But we'll discover that another day. But and there is a very interesting basis to it. But that means when someone asks the question, what is your Bible? A lot of Indians will run around in their mind looking for, oh my God, what's a book? What's a book? What's a book? And then come up with a book. And often it's the Bhagavad Gita. And they just trot it out, the Bhagavad Gita. And then the Christian, Jew, or Muslim goes, very nice, thank you very much. The difficulty there is both people have communicated like this. They've completely missed each other. So the Indian, in his cultural anxiety to please someone, has not questioned the question, not said, well, there isn't a book. It's a different tradition, and we have to look at it differently. In trying to help the person, they've come up with a book. Unfortunately, the book is not a book, it's a chapter in the Mahabharata. The Mahabharata will be the book, but the Mahabharata is not the most influential book in Hindu culture. The Bhagavad Purana is the most influential book in Hindu culture. And very few people know the Bhagavad Purana outside of India. But all the stories of the Bhagavad Purana have influenced aesthetics and architecture and poetry and dance and music and philosophy and theology and politics and economics for hundreds of years. And it's influenced Bollywood. If you ever see a Bollywood film and someone's going to talk about religion, they don't talk about someone experiencing the oneness that looks terrible on camera. They look at someone who's in the middle of a festival or in the middle of worshiping deities, etc. So yes. Anyway, that's a bit of a rant. And that's, so we began to realize that we don't really even know how to approach Hindu studies. And that was one of the intellectual challenges that we had at the beginning of our journey. And that was quite a challenge, not only in the academy to get people on board with that, but also in the Hindu communities, to get Hindu communities to realize that you need to develop intellectually. And there are many Hindu communities with very diverse approaches, intellectual approaches. They have their own hermeneutics and epistemology and all these wonderful academic words, but they haven't really been explored very, very well. So there isn't a vocabulary of discourse between the traditions. That is a real problem when it comes to globalization, because if we are insisting that people study according to these academic norms, this is what scholarship is, and there's no other discussion, we have limited the ability of scholarship to discuss. We're not allowing questions to be asked. We're not allowing scholarship itself to be critiqued by other traditions that didn't develop it. And this is part of what globalization could be. It's not what part of globalization is. I would argue that the last bastion of colonialism is in the academy, where it has this insistence that there's only one way of studying a thing, this rationalist, often reductionist approach to scholarship. And globalization, as we know it now, is political and economic, but we haven't gone into the intellectual or the spiritual. And I think that's a real That's a real difficulty. So that's one of the important reasons to study Hinduism. So why Hinduism? Why not other traditions? So Hinduism and Buddhism and Jainism are quite linked in terms of their roots, going back to the Vedas. So Buddhism will reject the Vedas, but in rejecting the Vedas, in being Protestant against, it's dependent on. It gets all its ideas of meditation, a lot of its practices, a lot of its philosophy are from Vedic assumptions, as with Hinduism, as with Jainism. So they're quite linked. But these three traditions have had a huge influence on all of Asia, and going both ways into the Middle East, which was anything beyond Constantinople at the time was considered Asia in olden times. A lot of traffic between the Middle East and India, and an awful lot of traffic with Buddhism between India and China and Japan. And I was surprised going to Japan, discovering Shinto, which was a traditional religion revived in reaction to Buddhism. But in the tradition, you have the deities of Indra and Varuna and other Hindu deities. Where did these come from? And then you go down Cambodia and Thailand and Laos and up into Bali and Fiji, and different forms of Hinduism. The biggest Hindu temple in the world, the biggest Hindu temple complex, is in Cambodia, in Angkor Wat. The national story of Thailand is the Ramayana, which they're quite convinced is their story. And the one of the languages of the country is Sanskrit. So the thinking of the East, and this is the largest portion of the population of the planet, has been influenced by Indian thought and, in our case, by Hindu thought, in as much as the West has been influenced by Greek thought. These are the two great thought traditions in the world. In an audit we did at our center some years ago in India of Indian philosophy departments, we found that in all the major Indian philosophy departments in India, that 80% of the curriculum was Western philosophy and 20% was Indian philosophy. And that was a little poor. And there are only two places in the Western world that have Indian philosophy programs set into their university curriculums. That's the University of Hawaii, and in the last 2 years, the University of Oxford. And that's it. So we're not looking at one of the major influences in terms of thought leadership in the planet. In fact, not only we're not looking at, we're ignoring it. And I think that would be to our cost economically and politically in the long run. I don't think it's healthy from a global perspective. It's certainly not healthy for India, where they've spent over 75 years not teaching religion or philosophy in their curriculums. There's no religion at any level of education in India. And that's a decision Nehru made at the time of independence. I think it's a very strange decision that secularization means you teach no religion. I think for India particularly, the idea would be you teach every religion, because that seems to be the ethos of the heritage of the country intellectually. So it wasn't gelling with the normal heritage of the country, and that has caused real difficulties. It means that now, when political Hinduism is such a major force in politics, there isn't an intellectual vocabulary to discuss the subject. So Hinduism is being touted in purely political terms, and no one has a vocabulary to deal with it. The only real opposition is Marxist-Leninism. So you have nationalist Hindu politics and Marxist-Leninism, both philosophical concepts that aren't Indian. They're both from a Western context. So what has happened to Indian intellectual tradition? Who is able to define Hinduism? Who speaks for Hinduism? And that dearth leaves a vacuum where fundamentalism and extremism can thrive. And that's dangerous. That's just simply dangerous politically, and that has obvious economic ramifications. So there are some thoughts. And on a personal level, I'm interested in the subject because if I look at something like Samadharsana, Emma's in the chat room. I hate the chat room because then I have to read it and talk at the same time. I've never been able to deal with that. Oh, well, she's got into a whole thing about neuroplasticity. Goodness gracious, Emma, well done. Very impressive. It isn't good. Well, actually, it isn't good to limit choice. Well, that was one of the points I was going to make. So thank you. I'll use it as a segue to the second point I was going to make. I'll make it first. If we look at the teaching method in the Bhagavad Gita, which I mentioned earlier, so the Bhagavad Gita is an interesting text. It's only 700 verses or shlokas, so it's readable as compared to a lot of other Hindu texts. Like the Bhagavad Purana I mentioned is 14,500 verses. The Mahabharata is 120,000 verses. So these are huge tomes. So the Gita is accessible. It's like a high school edition, entry level. So in that text, Krishna is teaching the prince Arjuna. Arjuna is in a bit of a funk, and he asks Krishna for help, and Krishna starts to lay out his choices. And it's very interesting, the choices that he's laying out for Arjuna. So one of the choices he lays out is, if you don't fight, people will laugh at you. There's nothing dharmic, religious, or spiritual about that choice. It just happens to be a choice. So Krishna lays out yogic choices. He tells Arjuna, yeah, you could go to the forest and you could sit on a deer skin and sit with your legs crossed like this and your back erect and looking at the tip of your nose. Do you know why you do that, by the way, yogically? Why you look at the tip of your nose? Because your eyes are then half open and half closed. So you're half closed so you don't see much of what's going around, you're not disturbed, and you're half open so you don't fall asleep. Voila. So there's method in it all. So he's giving him all these interesting instructions. And then Arjuna kind of says, I can't do that. You know, I'm a warrior. It's beginning to dawn on him, because at the beginning of the conversation, Arjuna was saying that's exactly what he's going to do. He's just going to walk away and just go up to the hills and just, leave the world behind and be that yogi. But no, he's not. So Krishna gives him choices, material and spiritual and dharmic and all kinds of choices. And then at the end of the conversation, he says, now deliberate on this fully, Arjuna, and do what you wish to do. So this isn't a dogmatic presentation. This isn't doctrinaire in any way. This isn't Arjuna saying to him, this is what you have to do. This is the only option you have. It's the only way, Arjuna. He's saying, Arjuna, there are many ways. And it's a bit like your child comes to you and says, I want to go clubbing. First time they've ever asked this question, 15-year-old kid. And you're looking at them going, oh my God, no, I'm not going to let you go clubbing. Don't be mad. I know what's going to happen. Sex, drugs, and rock and roll. Oh, forget it. And so how do you know that? Because you've done it yourself, obviously. So then you have a conversation with them. And the conversation is about, don't do this, don't look at that, don't look at that, be back by 10 or whatever it is. That's the conversation. But what if the conversation was, do you know when you go there, it's going to be sex, drugs, and rock and roll. People are going to offer you stuff. They're going to offer you ecstasy. They're going to offer you joints. You're going to talk to them in a way they've never heard you speak before. They don't even know you know this terminology or these drugs or this alcohol. And boys are going to come and they're going to say how beautiful you are. Our girls are going to come and pose in certain ways. And you've got to start making decisions about your life. You're giving them choice, because you're giving them knowledge. So when they go, someone comes and offers them a thing and they go, oh, what's that? Not that they offer them a thing and you go, what's that? I say, it's good, just take it. It's fun, just take it. Because that's kind of how it happens. But you've actually given them more information and you've allowed them to question it in an adult way. So then when someone comes and offers them all the wonders of the world, you can have a more reasonable conversation and they can say no. Based on their own decision. So, and this is the information that Arjuna gave him. So choice is a principle that you'll see reflected in all the Vedic texts. All the teachers are giving their students choice. So as that kind of educational principle, if I take that principle and superimpose it on the world as a template and say, educationally, do we have choice in the world intellectually? And actually, no, we don't, because we don't know much about Hindu thought or Indian thought in general. We don't know much about the thinking of more than half the planet. And that's actually choice. We've been limited in a very severe way. And no one cares. No one's quite accountable. And it's a bit of a fate thing. India decided itself not to study its own heritage in this regard. Therefore, why should anyone else take it seriously? That is a relevant question. India doesn't put any money into this form of education. Therefore, why should students take it seriously? There are really not many centers for that kind of education. Therefore, why should students take it seriously anywhere in the world? So these are real issues. We have limited choice quite severely. And the other issue is that I just like to throw out, it's just a personal thing for me. What distinguishes Hinduism from other world traditions? And the one thing that I found is the concept of Samadharsana, of equal vision. It's mentioned in the Gita, in the Upanishads, in the Puranas, and it comes from the idea of Atma from the Rig Veda, the idea of the self being made up of the body, the mind, the intellect, and this spiritual dimension that is not material, this non-material energy. So there's material energy and non-material energy. And this non-material energy is an ananda, it's eternal, and it's full of bliss and full of knowledge. And this material energy is temporary, it's miserable, and it's ignorant. And we've all experienced ignorance, misery, and things being temporary. I remember distinctly getting an FN rifle for my 11th birthday. I'd been looking for this FN rifle. It was a particular type of rifle. Boys get fixated about these things. And I got this rifle, and on Christmas Day, I broke it. And I remember being so miserable about the temporary nature of the world. But we've all experienced that. But it's interesting how we aspire for eternality, bliss, and knowledge, ever-ending, ever-increasing bliss, ever-ending, ever-increasing knowledge. So Indian philosophers have come to the conclusion, we don't even know who these people are, but they came to the conclusion that there was a distinction between these two energies. And this spiritual energy they defined as life. It's the life energy, the energy that's completely distinct from the material. And it's the energy that when you ask someone, do you remember when you were 7? And they say yes. And we can remember maybe being in our father's car with our legs dangling, not touching the floor or some such thing. Where is that body now? The body and the mind of that person are gone utterly. Every 7 years, every cell in our body changes. So the Gita says, matras prashastukuntno, dehina shminyathadehe komaram yovanam jarad. Dehina, the body, it changes from childhood to youth to old age. And Krishna is saying in that text that we reincarnate, we enter into different karnas, different flesh regularly in this lifetime. That's a process that's already going on. So the question is, who's the person who's remembering being 7? Because the body has disappeared completely. And that's how they're discerning that this person is different. And they discern that the idea of happiness. Anyway, I could get into a workshop experience here, but it's difficult to do on Zoom, I think. But so anyway, so that's the idea. But the idea that life energy is completely different means to me that all life is special. Not just my life, but all life is special, that life energy, the non-material energy. So when I see a dog is as special as I am because a dog has the same life energy, and an elephant, and a black person, and a Chinese person, and a woman, and a man, and all these designations are quite immaterial. And this is very much classic Hindu thought, shall we say. But then that means on a practical level, if I look at the environment, I see that, well, the laws that we have currently are based on the concept of human dignity, but that excludes the dignity of other forms of life, which are equal, Samadharsana, equal vision. So should our legal system be based on the concept of dignity of all life rather than just human life? Because if it's just human life, is it not speciesist? Are we not convincing ourselves, maybe without sufficient evidence, that we're better than everybody else, that we're better than all other life, and other forms of life can become extinct because it doesn't really matter, because they don't have rights? And it's a big assumption to make. And this philosophical perspective is challenging it. And it's a philosophical worldview held by many people in the East, not just in India, but it's not part of global discourse. So again, it's an issue of a globalization that doesn't exist, that could help improve our planet. I just mentioned this point because COP26 is laboring to come to a conclusion today based on philosophical perspectives, philosophical assumptions that might be quite deficient in terms of helping them come to a conclusion that could help the planet more holistically.